by me, Marvin Fant. Go to Amazon.com, click on the book section, put in my name, Marvin Fant, and my various books will come up, including Renew Your Mind. That's it.
All right, aside from my usual messages from a Christian perspective, I'm helping to bring to light the little known and little talked about experience of the black soldier in World War II. You'll get this from no documentary, past or present, and definitely not from school books from elementary to college. What you'll get is the horror, shame, indignation, hate, and unbridled evil that most white Americans unleashed upon their fellow black Americans during a time of war that the entire world was embroiled in, but yet we were spat upon, berated, and called a no-good nigger because we dared to have a uniform on. So here now, in this series are excerpts from the book Forgotten. One evening in early June 1941, Wilson Monk stopped by as usual to see his mother. Rosita was distressed. A telegram had arrived addressed to her youngest son. The contents were no surprise. Young men across New Jersey and the nation were being called up for military service. Wilson had registered for the draft the previous autumn. Shortly after President Roosevelt signed into law the Selective Training and Service Act, requiring able-bodied men from ages 21 to 35 to serve for at least 1 year. At the time, military service carried little risk. The vast majority of Americans, which was 79% in a Gallup poll, wanted the country to stay out of the war in Europe. And isolationists in Congress were determined to keep it that way. Your boys are not going to be sent to any foreign war, Roosevelt repeatedly promised, though he was now adding, unless we are attacked. Concerns that America would be drawn into the confrontation multiplied with each German victory. Fears mounted, and later in June, when Adolf Hitler broke a non-aggression pact he had linked with Joseph Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union, Wilson Monk wasn't thinking about the possibility of being sent to a far-off battlefield. To him, the draft notice meant only one thing: a steady paycheck. And even after Labor Day, the usual season of worry, he would be working. It meant that I would be making $30 a month. $30 a month, get that. And that was good money, he said. On June 10th, he packed his bags and he promised his mother that he would come home for Christmas. She gave him a kiss goodbye and wrapped him in a tight hug. None of them could know that 6 months later, a surprise Japanese attack in Hawaii would seal Wilson's service for the next 4 years. So for now, joining the Army, the only branch of the armed forces accepting Negroes, seemed like a grand adventure with pay. Wilson Monk reported for duty at Fort Dix, New Jersey, joining 1.4 million enlisted men nationwide, and 74,000 of them were black. 1 week later, he was sent to Fort Eustis, Virginia for basic training. Wilson's introduction to the South wasn't so pleasant, though. As a black man, he was accustomed to the small daily indignities that marked his interactions with white people. And there were places where he couldn't eat or drink or do window shopping because he wasn't allowed to peer. And there was a beach where he was barred from swimming. But that treatment seemed generous now, and nothing had prepared the soft-spoken young man for life in a segregated army or for life in the deeper South, home to most of the Army's training camps. Black men were lynched there. In some places, they could be charged with rape if they were caught just looking at a white woman. And failing to step aside for a white man on a public sidewalk could land a black man on a prison chain gang or in a coal mine as a modern-day slave. Across the South, the mere presence of a black soldier was reviled by many whites who looked upon their uniforms as a provocation, a demand for acknowledgement in a world that was carefully constructed around the premise that white people were superior and colored people knew their place. It was a world where in 1941 social equality was impossible to imagine, as a schoolhouse where black and white children were taught side by side. Life on an army base offered no insulation from the slings and arrows of prejudice. In fact, it was worse in some respects because many of the officers were white Southerners, expert in inflicting humiliation with a particularly vile racist tongue. Southern officers were the majority in the peacetime Army and contributed to the racist attitude that infused Army ranks at every level. The generals in Washington believed early on that the best men to command Negro units were white men from the South, where 3/4 of the country's black population lived. The U.S. Army was thoroughly Jim Crow, with little contact between the races, except for the white officers who were put in charge of the Negro units. White and black enlisted men trained, dined, and slept and socialized with their own kind. There were separate clubs, clinics, and blood banks. New York recruit Charles Orett was stunned to learn that if the Negro sections in the 2 movie houses on base were full, black soldiers were forbidden to sit on the white side, even if there were empty seats. I never knew what discrimination meant until I went to Fort Eustis, he said. And then one Sunday, Wilson Monk and some friends went to Richmond, and they caught the last bus back to the base at 11 o'clock. As they settled in for the 80-mile ride, military police officers boarded the bus and told the black soldiers to get off. They stayed put. We wanted to know why, Wilson said. The MPs returned with local cops, and this time the black soldiers complied. When they did, white soldiers took their seats and made it back to Fort Eustis on time. Wilson and his friends couldn't get on another bus until Monday morning. They risked punishment for being AWL and spent a long, cold night seething in a Richmond bus station. Most northern recruits, like Monk, had expected a racial divide when they went south. What they hadn't counted on was the bald-faced hostility that hit them head-on at each and every turn of their journey as soldiers, even in their own camps. And Wilson Monk quickly learned the new rules. Besides segregated movie houses, black barracks often were the farthest to reach. Equipment that was in short supply for everyone before the war began in earnest would remain that way for the black soldier. Negroes could buy candy and gum at the PX, the post exchange, but forget about lounging around over a soda. One day in basic training, as a black recruit grabbed a baton during a relay race, an officer from Georgia yelled out, "Look at that nigger run." Wilson had never heard that slur used so freely in his life as he did at that base. The insult stung and hardened into a fit of rage over time. These men expected better from their government. They expected better from a military that urged them to fight for democracy and the rights of white people living in faraway places. As bad as it got at Fort Eustis, Virginia, and it wasn't the deep South, for men like Wilson Monk, the worst was yet to come. Enough said.